For several long seconds, neither of us moved. The apartment felt impossibly quiet, as though even the old refrigerator had decided to stop humming out of respect for the moment. Mason looked from me to the car keys still hidden behind my back, then let out a soft laugh that sounded equal parts relieved and exhausted. "You really stole my keys?" he asked. "Borrowed," I corrected with the smallest grin. "Temporarily. Should I be worried?" "Only if you planned on making another dramatic escape before sunrise." His shoulders finally relaxed, and the tightness that had followed us all the way home from Lake Michigan slowly melted away. "Fair enough," he admitted. We stood there for another awkward moment, neither of us entirely sure what came after a confession that had quietly changed everything. It felt strange because nothing around us had changed. The apartment looked exactly the same. My jacket still hung over the dining chair. His sneakers still sat beside the front door. The suitcase remained untouched in the hallway where he had left it earlier that evening. Yet somehow every familiar object seemed to belong to a different life than the one we had been living only a few hours before. I rubbed the back of my neck. "I think this is the part where normal people know exactly what to do." Mason chuckled softly. "Do you?" "Not even close." "Good," he replied. "Neither do I." We laughed together, quietly at first, then more naturally, as though the shared uncertainty itself had become comforting. It was not perfect confidence that brought us closer. It was finally admitting we were both equally terrified. "I made tea earlier," Mason said after a moment. "Chamomile? The emergency emotional support tea?" I asked. "Exactly. Then I definitely need some." We wandered into the kitchen together without another word. The small room had never seemed warmer. Mason reached automatically for the kettle while I leaned against the counter watching him move through the familiar routine I had seen hundreds of times over the past year. He opened the cabinet without looking. The tea bags were always in the second tin. The honey lived on the middle shelf. Before I even reached toward the cupboard, he instinctively picked up my favorite blue ceramic mug instead of one of the others. "You did it again," I said. He glanced over. "Did what?" "You picked my mug without even thinking." He looked down, then laughed under his breath. "I guess I did. You always do." For a brief second, we simply looked at each other. Neither of us had realized how many tiny habits we had memorized until now. Loving someone, it turned out, sometimes looked less like dramatic declarations and more like remembering which mug they always reached for before they even knew they wanted it. Mason poured the hot water, and fragrant steam curled gently into the air between us. The apartment slowly filled with the calming scent of chamomile and honey. I accepted the mug from him, and our fingers brushed together for only a heartbeat before lingering almost unconsciously. Neither of us hurried to pull away. The touch was impossibly light, yet it carried months of feelings we had both quietly hidden beneath ordinary conversations and everyday routines. We eventually settled onto opposite ends of the couch, while an old nature documentary played softly on the television. Neither of us had any interest in penguins or frozen coastlines, but the quiet narration gave us something to listen to whenever silence threatened to become overwhelming. Every few minutes, one of us opened our mouth to speak before deciding against it. Eventually, I smiled toward the screen. "So, are we actually watching penguins?" Mason blinked as though he had forgotten the television existed. "Apparently. Do you even like documentaries?" "Honestly, not really." "Then why this one?" He smiled sheepishly. "Because staring at you for an hour felt significantly more intimidating." I nearly laughed into my tea. "That might be the most honest thing you have ever admitted." "I have been unusually honest tonight." "You really have." Another peaceful silence settled over the room. Outside, headlights drifted briefly across the living room ceiling before disappearing into the sleeping neighborhood. Somewhere in the building, a door quietly closed. The ordinary sounds of apartment life continued exactly as they always had, yet I noticed them differently now. They no longer reminded me of loneliness. They reminded me that I was home. After several minutes, I finally gathered enough courage to ask the question that had quietly lingered in my chest ever since I called him from downtown. "Can I tell you something embarrassing?" Mason turned toward me immediately. "Always." I stared into the steam rising from my mug. "When I called you tonight, I was already rehearsing an apology before you even answered." His expression softened instantly. "Why?" "Because I thought you deserved one peaceful evening without having to rescue your hopeless roommate again." He shook his head before I could continue. Ethan, you have never been hopeless. I lost my wallet. Unfortunate. My phone died. Also unfortunate. I nearly stranded myself downtown after midnight. A tiny smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. Still not hopeless. I looked at him curiously. Then what am I? His answer came without the slightest hesitation. Someone I wanted to make sure got home safely. The words settled quietly inside my heart, warmer than the tea in my hands. There were no dramatic promises and no impossible speeches. Just the simple truth that Mason had always shown through actions long before either of us found the courage to speak it aloud. For the first time in months, I allowed myself to believe that maybe home had never been the apartment we shared. Maybe it had always been the person sitting only a few feet away. Somewhere around the middle of the documentary, exhaustion finally caught up with me. My eyelids grew heavier every time I blinked, and the soothing voice describing penguins surviving another Antarctic winter slowly faded into little more than background noise. I tried to stay awake, mostly because I was not ready for the evening to end. After everything that had happened beside Lake Michigan, after every quiet confession we had finally shared, the idea of walking into separate bedrooms again felt strangely disappointing. Mason noticed before I did. Long day, he asked quietly. Very. You should get some sleep. In a minute. He smiled. You said that 10 minutes ago. I know. I shifted on the couch, intending to sit up straighter, but instead found myself leaning gently to one side. Before I realized what I was doing, my head came to rest against his shoulder. My entire body froze. Sorry, I whispered immediately, beginning to pull away. Mason remained perfectly still. You do not have to apologize. Are you sure? Very sure. His answer came so naturally that I slowly relaxed again. The steady rhythm of his breathing was strangely calming. I had imagined this moment so many times over the past year that reality almost felt less overwhelming than the fantasy. Neither of us spoke. We simply sat there while the documentary continued playing unnoticed. A few minutes later, I felt something soft settle over my shoulders. Mason had quietly unfolded the throw blanket from the back of the couch and draped it around me with the same gentle care he brought to everything he did. I smiled without lifting my head. You really think of everything. He shrugged slightly. Occupational habit. You are off duty. Apparently not. His quiet humor made me laugh. The sound echoed softly through the apartment before fading into another comfortable silence. After a while I spoke again, my voice barely louder than the television. You are going to make it impossible for me to stop falling in love with you. This time Mason did not answer immediately. I could almost hear him searching for the right words. Finally he whispered, I was hoping the opposite would happen. I closed my eyes with a smile. I think we both lost that battle a long time ago. Neither of us tried to say anything after that. We did not need to. Sometimes silence carried far more honesty than conversation ever could. Nearly half an hour passed before I reluctantly sat up and stretched. The clock above the bookshelf read almost 3 in the morning. We should probably sleep, I said. Mason nodded. Probably. We switched off the television and carried our empty mugs into the kitchen together. Without speaking, we washed them side by side, bumping elbows once before laughing at ourselves. It felt oddly domestic, as though we had unknowingly crossed into a new chapter of our lives without any dramatic announcement. When everything had been put away, we walked toward the hallway where our bedroom doors faced one another. We stopped almost simultaneously. Good night, Ethan, Mason said softly. Good night, Mason. I hesitated before taking another step. And, thank you. For what? For answering the phone. For coming to get me. For staying. For all of it. He looked at me with the same warmth that had quietly followed me through the entire evening. I will always come if you need me. This time I believed him completely. I stepped into my room, but before closing the door I glanced back one last time. Mason was still standing outside his own room, watching to make sure I had made it inside safely. When our eyes met, we exchanged one final smile before quietly closing our doors. For the first time in almost a year, the hallway separating our bedrooms no longer felt like an impossible distance. It felt like the shortest walk in the world. The next morning's sunlight slipped gently through my curtains, and for several peaceful seconds I forgot everything that had happened the night before. Then I noticed something unusual. Instead of waking with the familiar ache of wondering whether I had imagined Mason's feelings, I woke smiling. The memory of his shoulder beneath my head, the blanket he had wrapped around me, and the quiet promise that he would always come if I needed him returned all at once. I walked into the kitchen expecting the usual sleepy silence, only to find Mason already standing at the stove making pancakes. He glanced over his shoulder and smiled as though seeing me there was the most natural thing in the world. "Morning," he said. "Morning. Coffee, please." He poured my favorite blend without asking how I took it. I laughed softly. "You memorized that too?" "Cream first. 1 spoon of sugar." He handed me the mug. "I have had a year to learn." I looked at him over the rim of the cup. "I guess I have been paying attention too." He raised an eyebrow. "Really? You always flip the first pancake too early because you get impatient." He stared at the pan before laughing as he noticed the slightly uneven pancake waiting on the plate. "I hate how accurate that is." "I also know you hum when you are happy." His smile grew a little wider. "Do I? You have been humming for the last 5 minutes." He looked down shyly, unable to deny it. Standing there together in our tiny kitchen, surrounded by nothing more extraordinary than coffee, pancakes, and morning sunlight, I realized something beautiful. Love had not arrived in one unforgettable moment beside the lake. It had been quietly growing inside hundreds of ordinary mornings just like this one, waiting patiently until both of us were finally brave enough to notice it. Breakfast stretched far longer than either of us expected. Neither of us seemed eager to rush back into the routines that had quietly defined our lives before everything changed. We lingered over coffee long after the pancakes had disappeared, talking about nothing particularly important. Mason told me about a rookie paramedic who had accidentally locked himself inside the supply closet the previous week, and I laughed so hard I nearly spilled my coffee across the table. I shared an embarrassing story from work involving an email that had been sent to the entire department instead of one coworker, and Mason's laughter filled the apartment with a warmth I had not realized I had been missing for months. At some point I noticed how relaxed he looked. The constant tension that had lived around his eyes seemed lighter, replaced by the quiet comfort of someone who no longer felt the need to guard every word. After we finished cleaning the kitchen, I opened the refrigerator and frowned dramatically. We have exactly half a bottle of milk, 1 lonely tomato, and enough eggs to feed a confused pigeon. Mason stepped beside me and inspected the nearly empty shelves with exaggerated seriousness. The pigeon would still complain. "Probably. We should go grocery shopping." I looked at him with an amused smile. "Together?" He blinked. "Unless you would rather I go alone." "No." The answer escaped almost instantly. "Together sounds better." 20 minutes later, we were walking through the neighborhood grocery store, pushing a shopping cart whose squeaky wheel announced our arrival in every aisle. Usually we split the list, each wandering off in opposite directions before meeting again at the checkout. This time neither of us suggested separating. We simply stayed side by side as though it was the most natural thing in the world. "Milk," Mason read from the list. "Bread," I added. "Coffee," he continued. "Definitely coffee," I agreed. We wandered slowly through the store, occasionally reaching for the same carton or package before laughing and letting the other take it instead. The tiny moments no longer felt awkward. They felt effortless. Near the bakery section, I quietly slipped a package of chocolate chip cookies into the cart. Mason noticed immediately. Those were not on the list. Neither was unexpectedly falling in love with my roommate. He smiled, trying not to laugh. "That is not a valid shopping category. Neither are emergency happiness cookies. I suppose I can make an exception." A few minutes later, I caught him carefully placing his favorite cinnamon granola into the cart when he thought I was not looking. "Interesting," I said. "I thought someone claimed that granola was too expensive." He looked completely innocent. "I have no idea what you were talking about." "Really?" I picked up the bag and held it in front of him. "Because the evidence appears to disagree." He laughed, surrendering immediately. "Fine. I wanted the granola. See? Honesty looks good on you. I could say the same thing about you." By the time we reached the checkout lane, our cart held far more snacks than actual groceries. Standing in line, I instinctively reached for my wallet before remembering it had disappeared the previous night. My hand froze halfway to my pocket. Mason noticed without a word. Before I could say anything, he quietly paid for everything as though it were the most ordinary thing in the world. Outside the store, I sighed. "I am paying you back." "I know. I really mean it. I know. Would you stop making it impossible to argue with you?" He smiled as he picked up 2 grocery bags. "You are welcome to keep trying." The afternoon sun painted long shadows across the sidewalk as we started walking home together. The air carried the comforting smell of fresh bread from the bakery around the corner, and somewhere nearby a street musician played a slow acoustic version of an old song neither of us could quite identify. Halfway down the block, we noticed an elderly woman struggling with two heavy grocery bags near the entrance to her apartment building. Before I had time to offer, Mason had already crossed the sidewalk. "May I help you carry those upstairs?" he asked gently. Her face brightened with relief. "That would be wonderful, dear." He carried both bags inside while I waited near the entrance, watching through the glass doors as he patiently matched his pace to hers, never once appearing rushed despite the long shift he had worked only the day before. Nearly 10 minutes later he returned, slightly out of breath, but smiling. "Sorry about that." I shook my head. "Do not apologize. She only lives on the second floor." That is not why I was smiling. He looked at me curiously. "Then why?" I adjusted one of the grocery bags on my shoulder before answering. "Because moments like that remind me why everyone trusts you so easily." His cheeks turned faintly pink. "I was only helping." "Exactly." We resumed our walk home in comfortable silence. As I glanced at the man walking beside me, balancing grocery bags with one hand while holding the apartment keys in the other, I realized that the qualities making me fall in love with Mason had never been grand or dramatic. They lived inside the smallest moments. The way he noticed people others overlooked. The way he remembered my favorite mug without thinking. The way he made room for kindness in every ordinary day. Somewhere between the grocery store and our apartment building, I quietly admitted to myself that I had stopped imagining what life might look like without him. Every future I could picture now somehow included Mason walking beside me exactly like this. Back at the apartment, we unpacked the groceries together, falling into the familiar rhythm we had built over an entire year of sharing the same space. Mason rinsed the vegetables while I organized everything inside the refrigerator, quietly pretending not to notice that he was rearranging the shelves so my favorite yogurt always stayed within easy reach. "You know," I said, closing the refrigerator door, "you have been organizing this kitchen the exact same way since the week we moved in." He looked over his shoulder. "Have I? The fruit always goes on the top shelf. Coffee on the left. Tea on the right. Snacks where I can find them without thinking." He smiled sheepishly. I figured it made mornings easier. "For me?" He shrugged as though the answer was obvious. "For us." That single word settled warmly in my chest. Us. It was such a small word, yet somehow it sounded entirely different now. Before, it had simply meant two roommates sharing an apartment. Now it carried the quiet promise of something neither of us was afraid to imagine anymore. We spent the next hour preparing lunch together. Mason chopped vegetables while I boiled pasta, occasionally stealing pieces of cheese before they reached the cutting board. "I saw that," he said without turning around. "You cannot prove anything. You have cheese on your shirt." I looked down and laughed. "That is surprisingly convincing evidence. I work in emergency medicine. Observation is part of the job. I thought saving lives was the important part. Multitasking." He handed me a clean towel, his fingers brushing mine once again. Neither of us seemed embarrassed by those accidental touches anymore. In fact, they were beginning to feel less accidental every time they happened. Lunch itself was wonderfully ordinary. We sat across from each other eating pasta with garlic bread that had become slightly too crispy because we had both been laughing instead of watching the oven. "I blame you," I said. "You were the one telling the embarrassing college story. You were laughing too hard to hear the timer." "That is because your impression of Professor Henderson was disturbingly accurate." Mason grinned proudly. "Thank you. That was not a compliment." I accepted it anyway. After lunch, we cleaned the kitchen together, bumping shoulders as we moved around the small space. At one point, we both reached for the same dish towel. Our hands met, and instead of pulling away, Mason simply intertwined his fingers with mine for a brief moment. He smiled quietly before letting go again and returning to drying the dishes as though nothing unusual had happened. Yet everything about that tiny gesture stayed with me for the rest of the afternoon. It felt wonderfully natural, like something we had forgotten to do rather than something entirely new. Later, while I folded laundry in the living room, Mason disappeared into his bedroom. A few minutes passed before he returned carrying an old cardboard box. He placed it gently on the coffee table and sat beside me. "I found these while cleaning my closet." Curious, I opened the box. Inside were photographs from the past year, ticket stubs from baseball games, receipts from restaurants we had tried together, a tiny souvenir keychain from a weekend road trip, and several Polaroid pictures our neighbors had taken during apartment gatherings. I picked up one photo showing the two of us assembling an impossibly complicated bookshelf shortly after moving in. Mason's hair was sticking up in every direction, and I had sawdust across my face. We looked exhausted. I laughed. We were exhausted, he replied. That bookshelf almost defeated us. I smiled as I continued sorting through the photographs. There were birthday dinners, neighborhood festivals, movie nights, snow-covered sidewalks after a winter storm, and even one blurry picture of us carrying far too many grocery bags because we had refused to make a second trip from the car. Looking through them felt strangely emotional. At the time, each picture had simply captured another ordinary day. Together, they told the story of two people quietly building a life neither of them had fully understood until now. "Can I admit something?" Mason asked softly. "Of course." He looked down at one of the photographs before speaking. "Every time we took a picture together, I secretly hoped there would be another one." I turned toward him. "Because you like collecting memories?" He shook his head with an embarrassed smile. "Because I liked imagining there would always be another reason for us to be standing beside each other." My heart tightened. I reached into the box and pulled out the newest instant photo we had taken only a month earlier during a neighborhood barbecue. Without thinking, I placed it carefully on the bookshelf above the television where we would see it every day. Mason watched me with quiet curiosity. "Why there?" he asked. I smiled. "Because I think this one deserves a permanent place." He looked at the picture for several seconds before his gaze returned to me. "I like that idea." As the afternoon sunlight streamed gently through the living room windows, illuminating the tiny photograph resting on the shelf, I realized our apartment no longer felt like a temporary place where two roommates happened to live. It had slowly become the first home either of us truly wanted to keep building together. One ordinary day, one shared meal, one quiet memory, and one gentle smile at a time. The next few days settled into a rhythm neither of us had expected, but both quietly treasured. Nothing dramatic happened. There were no grand declarations waiting around the corner, no impossible misunderstandings, and no emergencies demanding that we define everything all at once. Instead, life continued in the wonderfully ordinary way it always had. The only difference was that neither of us felt the need to hide the small moments anymore. On Tuesday evening, Mason sent me a message saying he would be finishing a late shift at the ambulance station. Normally, I would have answered with a simple "drive safely." Instead, I found myself standing outside the station just after sunset, holding 2 paper cups of hot coffee that warmed my hands against the cool Chicago evening. When the station doors finally opened, several paramedics stepped outside laughing about something that had happened during the day. Mason was the last one to appear. He looked tired. His hair was slightly messy, and faint shadows rested beneath his eyes, evidence of another demanding shift. The moment he noticed me, he stopped walking. Surprise quickly softened into a smile that reached all the way to his eyes. "Ethan," he asked, "what are you doing here?" I lifted one of the cups toward him. "Delivering emergency coffee to an emergency medical technician." He laughed, quietly as he accepted it. "You really did not have to come." "I know." We started walking slowly toward the parking lot together. "But I kept thinking about how many times you have shown up for me without ever being asked." Mason looked down at the cup for a long moment before speaking again. "No one has ever come to pick me up after work before." His voice remained calm, but something about those words tightened my chest. "Really?" He nodded with a small shrug. "I am usually the one driving everyone else home." Without overthinking it, I reached for his hand. This time there was no hesitation from either of us. Our fingers fit together naturally, as though they had always belonged that way. Mason glanced down at our joined hands before looking back at me with quiet amazement. "I figured it was your turn to let someone take care of you," I said softly. He squeezed my hand just enough for me to feel it. "I think I could get used to that." Instead of driving home immediately, we stopped at the little neighborhood park across the street from our apartment building. The benches were nearly empty, and the last traces of sunset painted warm shades of orange across the sky. We sat together watching people finish evening walks, parents calling children home for dinner, and a golden retriever enthusiastically chasing a tennis ball across the grass. Everything around us was ordinary, yet somehow it all felt unforgettable. "Can I tell you something?" Mason asked. Always. He looked toward the fading sunlight before speaking. For months I kept convincing myself that if I never admitted how I felt, eventually the feelings would disappear. I smiled gently. Did they? He laughed under his breath. Not even a little. Mine did not either. He turned toward me. Really? Every time you left for work before sunrise, I would hear the apartment door close and wonder if I had missed another chance to tell you how important you had become. Mason lowered his eyes for a moment before smiling to himself. It is strange. What is? We were both trying so hard to protect our friendship that neither of us realized we were making ourselves lonely. I nodded slowly. Not anymore. We remained there until the first stars appeared above the city. At one point our shoulders touched, and this time neither of us even noticed exactly when it happened. It simply felt comfortable. On the walk back home, we stopped at a small family-owned ice cream shop that stayed open late during the summer. Mason ordered vanilla. I ordered chocolate. 5 minutes later, we traded cones because he insisted mine tasted better while I claimed exactly the opposite. The elderly woman working behind the counter laughed as she watched us switch desserts halfway down the sidewalk. You two have been together a long time? She asked with a knowing smile. Mason looked at me for the briefest second before answering. It feels like we have. My heart skipped quietly inside my chest. We continued home, sharing one ice cream cone between us, laughing every time one of us insisted the other should take the next bite. When we finally reached the apartment building, neither of us hurried inside. We stood beneath the warm glow of the entrance light, enjoying the comfortable silence that had become one of my favorite parts of every day. Mason looked at me with that same gentle expression I had come to know so well. Thank you, he said. For what? For reminding me that coming home can mean more than walking through a front door. I smiled as I reached for his hand again. Home was never this apartment. He intertwined his fingers with mine without hesitation. Then what is it? I looked into his eyes, no longer afraid of the answer. It is wherever you are. Mason's smile was small, but it carried enough warmth to make the entire evening feel brighter. Together we walked inside, not as two roommates trying to ignore what they felt, but as two people who had finally discovered that the happiest love stories were often built from quiet conversations, shared routines, and the simple promise of always finding their way home to each other. The following Saturday arrived with clear blue skies and the kind of comfortable weather that seemed to invite everyone outside. Sunlight streamed through the apartment windows long before either of us bothered to close the curtains, filling every corner with a warm golden glow. I wandered into the kitchen wearing an old college sweatshirt and found Mason already making coffee while quietly humming to himself. He looked over as soon as he heard my footsteps. Good morning. Morning. I smiled. You are humming again. His ears turned slightly pink. Was I? Only when you are happy. He laughed under his breath. Then I guess you caught me. We carried our coffee onto the small apartment balcony where the neighborhood was slowly waking up below us. Someone walked a pair of energetic beagles across the street while children chased one another through the nearby park. Everything felt peaceful. Mason rested his elbows against the railing. Do you have any plans today? I pretended to think for a moment. Nothing that cannot wait until tomorrow. Good. Why? He smiled. I thought maybe we could spend the entire day doing absolutely nothing important. That sounds like the best plan I have heard all week. Less than an hour later, we found ourselves wandering through the weekend farmers market a few blocks from downtown. Colorful tents lined both sides of the street. Musicians played cheerful songs near the fountain, and the smell of fresh bread, roasted coffee, and flowers drifted through the cool morning air. Mason stopped at nearly every fruit stand, while I somehow managed to sample far more homemade jam than any reasonable person should have. You know those samples are supposed to help you choose, Mason teased. I am conducting serious research. By eating half the booth. Scientific research requires dedication. The elderly vendor laughed as she handed me another tiny cracker topped with blackberry preserves. Your boyfriend has excellent taste, she told Mason. We both froze for the briefest moment before looking at each other. Neither of us corrected her. Mason simply smiled politely. He usually does. My heart skipped so unexpectedly that I almost dropped the little paper cup in my hand. We continued walking, and after a few minutes I finally bumped his shoulder with mine. You did not correct her. He glanced sideways with an amused smile. Did you want me to? I thought about it for several seconds before shaking my head. Not really. Neither did I. He reached for my hand without hesitation as we blended into the crowd of couples, families, and friends enjoying the beautiful morning. For the first time, holding his hand in public did not feel frightening. It simply felt right. We spent the next 2 hours wandering wherever the market happened to lead us. Mason insisted on buying a small potted herb because he claimed fresh basil would improve our pasta nights. I argued that one tiny plant could not possibly survive under our combined supervision. Have a little faith, he said. In the basil? In us. I laughed as the vendor carefully wrapped the plant before handing it to Mason. That is considerably more pressure than this poor basil deserves. Around lunchtime, we ordered sandwiches from a food truck and carried them to the grassy hill overlooking Lake Michigan. A gentle breeze rolled across the water, carrying the familiar scent of the lake that instantly reminded both of us of the evening when everything had changed. Mason looked toward the shoreline with a thoughtful smile. Funny how different this place feels now. I was thinking the same thing. The last time we were here, I thought I might lose my best friend. I turned toward him. Instead, you found something even better. He met my eyes, and the quiet warmth in his expression said more than words ever could. We finished lunch slowly, talking about childhood memories, favorite vacations, impossible dreams, and the tiny apartment we had somehow turned into a home together. At one point, Mason leaned back on the grass, closing his eyes as the sunlight warmed his face. I watched him for several silent seconds before reaching over to brush a loose strand of hair away from his forehead. He opened one eye and smiled. What was that for? Your hair was in the way. Of what? Looking at you. He laughed, shaking his head in disbelief. You have become surprisingly bold. I spent too long pretending not to say things I wanted to say. He reached for my hand again, intertwining our fingers as naturally as breathing. Then promise me something. Anything. Do not go back to pretending. I squeezed his hand gently. Only if you promise the same. Deal. We sealed the promise with nothing more dramatic than shared smiles beneath the bright Chicago sky, yet it somehow felt stronger than any elaborate declaration. As we sat together watching small sailboats drift across the sparkling water, I realized love was not measured by extraordinary moments alone. It lived inside quiet Saturdays, shared laughter, warm coffee, crowded markets, and the simple comfort of choosing the same person over and over again without ever feeling like it was a choice at all. Over the following weeks, our lives settled into a pattern that felt both beautifully familiar and completely new. We still woke up in the same apartment, argued over whose turn it was to take out the trash, and debated whether the thermostat was too warm or too cold. The difference was that every ordinary moment now carried an unmistakable sense of belonging. We no longer questioned whether we should spend time together. We simply did. Every morning, Mason left for work with a quiet, "See you tonight." And every evening, I found myself glancing at the clock more often than I cared to admit, waiting for the sound of his key in the front door. One Thursday afternoon, my phone buzzed while I was finishing paperwork at the office. It was a short message from Mason. Busy shift today. Might be late. Normally, I would have answered with a simple "no problem." Instead, I wrote, "Drive safely. Dinner will be waiting." Less than a minute later, 3 little dots appeared before his reply arrived. Looking forward to coming home. I smiled at the screen longer than was probably appropriate before slipping the phone back into my pocket. By the time evening arrived, rain had begun falling steadily across Chicago. I stood in the kitchen stirring a pot of homemade tomato soup while grilled cheese sandwiches browned slowly in the pan. The apartment filled with the comforting smell of melted butter and fresh herbs from the little basil plant we had somehow managed to keep alive. Every few minutes I glanced toward the window, watching headlights blur through the rain. Mason finally walked through the front door nearly an hour later than expected. The moment I saw him, I knew something was wrong. He smiled when he noticed me, but the smile never quite reached his eyes. His shoulders sagged beneath the weight of exhaustion, and tiny drops of rain still clung to his jacket despite the umbrella folded in his hand. "Rough day?" I asked gently. He slipped off his shoes and nodded. "We lost a patient this afternoon." The apartment became very quiet. I crossed the room without saying anything and wrapped my arms around him. For several long seconds, neither of us moved. Mason slowly returned the embrace, resting his forehead lightly against mine as he released a slow, tired breath. "Thank you," he whispered. "You do not have to thank me for hugging you." "I know." His voice remained soft. "But I am grateful anyway." We ate dinner at the kitchen table instead of in front of the television. Conversation came slowly at first. Mason never shared confidential details about work, but he quietly admitted that some days stayed with him longer than others. I listened without trying to solve anything. Every now and then I reached across the table and squeezed his hand, reminding him he did not have to carry every difficult day alone. After dinner, he stood at the sink washing dishes while I dried them beside him. "You know," he said after a while, "I used to come home after shifts like this and sit here in complete silence." I looked up. "Really?" He nodded. "I thought being alone was easier than letting someone see when I was tired." I gently placed the dish towel on the counter before turning toward him. "And now?" He smiled faintly. "Now I cannot imagine coming home without you asking how my day was." My heart tightened in the best possible way. Later that evening, we carried 2 mugs of hot chocolate onto the balcony despite the light rain still falling beyond the roofline. The city lights shimmered against the wet streets below, while distant thunder rolled somewhere over the lake. Mason leaned against the railing, wrapping both hands around his mug. "Can I confess something a little embarrassing?" he asked. "You already know I specialize in embarrassing confessions." He laughed quietly. "Every difficult shift ends the same way now." "How?" "The moment I climb back into the ambulance, I start thinking about getting home to you." I looked at him for a long moment before answering. "You have no idea how happy that makes me." "I think I do." He smiled warmly. "Because every time you text me good luck before work, I carry those words with me all day." I stepped closer until our shoulders touched. The rain continued falling softly around us, cool against the summer air, but neither of us hurried back inside. "Remember when you said you always wanted to make sure I got home safely?" I asked. Mason nodded. "I remember. I think we have both been doing that ever since." He looked at me with quiet affection before gently brushing a thumb across the back of my hand. "Home is not a place anymore." "No," I agreed softly. "It is a person." We remained on the balcony long after our hot chocolate had grown cold, watching the rain wash over the city while the apartment behind us glowed warmly through the open door. In that peaceful moment, I realized something I wished I had understood much sooner. Love was never about rescuing each other from extraordinary circumstances. It was about coming home after ordinary days, carrying each other's burdens a little more lightly, and discovering that even the hardest moments became easier simply because someone was waiting with the light on, a warm meal, and an open heart. As summer slowly gave way to early autumn, the city seemed to change around us almost overnight. The trees lining our neighborhood streets began turning shades of gold and crimson. The morning air carried a crisp chill that hinted winter was not far away, and coffee shops suddenly filled with the comforting scent of cinnamon and pumpkin. Life continued moving forward, but so did we. Loving Mason had quietly become the easiest part of every day. One Friday evening, we accepted an invitation from a few of his coworkers to celebrate the retirement of one of the senior paramedics. The gathering took place at a cozy neighborhood restaurant only a few blocks from the ambulance station. It was my first time meeting many of the people Mason worked beside every day, and within minutes I understood why they respected him so deeply. They greeted him with genuine affection, joking about old shifts, impossible rescue calls, and the countless times he had stayed late to help someone else finish paperwork. "So you are Ethan," one of the paramedics said with a knowing smile as we found our seats. "We have heard a lot about you." I looked toward Mason with an amused expression. "Should I be worried?" Mason immediately shook his head, although the slight blush on his cheeks suggested otherwise. His friend laughed. "Nothing bad. We just got tired of hearing him mention someone named Ethan every single day without ever introducing us." "That is not true," Mason protested. "Really?" another coworker asked. "Because every lunch break somehow ended with, 'Ethan would probably like this restaurant,' or 'Ethan makes better coffee than this place,' or 'Ethan keeps telling me I need more sleep.'" Laughter spread around the table while Mason covered his face with one hand. I could not stop smiling. "You talk about me that much?" He looked at me with embarrassed honesty before quietly answering. "More than I realized." Hearing those words made my heart feel impossibly light. The evening continued with stories, laughter, and far too much dessert. Watching Mason interact with the people who trusted him during some of the hardest moments of their careers only made me admire him more. He listened carefully whenever someone spoke, encouraged the younger paramedics without making them feel inexperienced, and never once tried to make himself the center of attention. Even among friends, his kindness remained effortless. Later that evening, one of the senior paramedics stood to give a short retirement speech. Before sitting down again, he smiled toward Mason. "There is one more thing," he said. "After 25 years doing this job, I have learned that the people waiting for us at home matter just as much as the people standing beside us in the ambulance." He looked directly at me. "Take good care of him. He spends every day taking care of everyone else." I nodded sincerely. "I promise." Mason glanced at me with an expression I would never forget. One filled with gratitude, affection, and quiet hope all at once. On the walk home, the city streets were calm, illuminated by rows of warm streetlights reflecting across the sidewalk after an afternoon shower. We walked hand in hand, without worrying who might see us. Somewhere along the way, Mason stopped outside the bakery where we had bought fresh bread together so many times before. He turned toward me with a thoughtful smile. "Can I ask you something?" "Anything." "Do you remember the first day we moved into the apartment?" I laughed softly. "You mean the day we argued for 20 minutes about how to fit a couch through the front door?" "Exactly. I remember thinking you were unbelievably stubborn." "I was. You still are." He accepted that accusation with a grin. "Back then I hoped we would become good roommates." "I hoped the same thing." He gently squeezed my hand. "I never imagined you would become the most important person in my life." For a moment, I could not find the right words. I simply stepped closer until only a few inches separated us. "You became mine too," I whispered. He smiled, the kind of smile that reached all the way to his eyes, and without saying another word, he wrapped me in a long, quiet embrace beneath the glow of the streetlights. People walked past without paying much attention. Cars continued driving through the intersection. The city never paused, yet somehow it felt as though time itself had slowed just for us. As we finally continued toward home, I realized that the greatest confirmation of our relationship had not come from dramatic declarations or extraordinary moments. It had arrived naturally, through friends who already knew my name before we met, through coworkers who understood how often Mason spoke about me, and through the simple truth that somewhere along the way we had quietly become the person each other looked forward to seeing at the end of every single day. 1 year later, the first snow of December drifted quietly across Chicago, settling on rooftops, sidewalks, and the familiar apartment building that had witnessed every step of our journey. Some mornings I still caught myself wondering how two people could spend so much time standing beside each other before finally realizing they had already become home. Then I would hear Mason humming softly in the kitchen while making coffee, and every doubt disappeared before it even had the chance to form. His transfer request had been approved several months earlier, allowing him to spend more evenings at home instead of constantly covering overnight shifts. We never celebrated with extravagant plans or expensive trips. Instead, we ordered too much pizza, argued over which movie deserved another rewatch, laughed until nearly midnight, and somehow turned the simplest evenings into my favorite memories. Loving Mason had never transformed life into a perfect fairy tale. We still forgot grocery lists. We still debated whether pineapple belonged on pizza. He still claimed my grilled cheese technique violated basic culinary principles, and I still insisted that the amount of sugar he poured into his coffee could legally qualify as dessert. The difference was that every ordinary disagreement ended with laughter instead of silence, and every ordinary day ended exactly where we both wanted to be. On the first Saturday after the season's snowfall, we decided to walk to Lake Michigan, the same place where everything had quietly begun. The lake looked completely different beneath a blanket of fresh snow. The trees stood bare against the pale winter sky, and only a handful of bundled-up joggers crossed the nearby path. We followed the shoreline slowly, our boots leaving matching footprints behind us. "Hard to believe it has been a year," Mason said softly. "Sometimes it feels longer. Sometimes it feels like yesterday." I smiled. "Both somehow make sense." He nodded as we stopped near the familiar bench overlooking the frozen water. "Do you remember what I told you here?" "Every word." He laughed quietly. "I was terrified. So was I. I thought telling you how I felt might ruin everything." I reached for his gloved hand. Instead, it gave us everything. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Snowflakes drifted lazily around us while the cold breeze swept across the lake. The city sounded distant, almost peaceful. Mason turned toward me, his eyes carrying the same gentle warmth that had first made me fall in love with him long before either of us had found the courage to admit it. He slowly lifted one hand and brushed a few snowflakes from my hair. "What?" I asked with a smile. "Nothing." He looked at me as though trying to memorize every detail of the moment. "I was just thinking about how lucky I am." My heart felt impossibly full. I was about to say the same thing. He stepped a little closer until only a few inches separated us. There were no dramatic speeches, no audience, and no perfect cinematic music playing in the background. There was only the quiet sound of snow falling, the frozen lake stretching endlessly behind us, and the person I loved standing right in front of me. Mason gently cupped my cheek with one gloved hand, giving me every opportunity to step away if I wanted to. I never even considered it. Instead, I closed the remaining distance between us. Our first kiss was soft, unhurried, and filled with every quiet feeling we had spent more than a year discovering together. It lasted only a few seconds, yet somehow it carried every shared breakfast, every grocery trip, every late-night conversation, every reassuring hug, every hand held across a crowded sidewalk, and every ordinary day that had slowly built something extraordinary. When we finally pulled apart, we were both smiling too much to pretend otherwise. "I have been wanting to do that for a very long time," Mason admitted. I laughed. "You and me both." He rested his forehead gently against mine. "Ready to go home?" I looked toward the apartment waiting somewhere beyond the snowy streets before looking back into his eyes. "We already are." Hand in hand, we turned away from the lake and began walking through the gently falling snow, leaving another pair of matching footprints behind us. They stretched side by side all the way down the quiet path, disappearing into the winter afternoon just as one chapter of our story quietly gave way to the next. I used to believe that love arrived in extraordinary moments that changed everything at once. Mason taught me something far more beautiful. Real love grows patiently inside. Ordinary mornings, shared meals, gentle laughter, familiar routines, and the simple decision to choose the same person every single day. Looking back, I realized our story had never really been about two roommates who accidentally fell in love. It had always been about two people who slowly discovered that the place they had both been searching for was never a destination. It was each other. And as we disappeared together beneath the softly falling snow, I knew with complete certainty that no matter where life carried us next, as long as we kept walking side by side, we would always find our way home.